time for our show. Let's be reasonable. This is a BR Peeps production. This show is dedicated to common people. We know that you probably get your news in one of three sources. Maybe it's network news, your mainstay NBC, ABC, CBS, or if it's cable, maybe it's MSNBC or Fox News or Newsmax, whoever it may be. A number of different silos where you're drawing your attention from. But it's our job in order to look at what they provide and then cast a reasonable and objective eye on the information in determining what in fact is the truth and how is it relevant to me. So that's our show. I mean, again, dedicated to common people. We just are interested in the facts, right? So when looking at the facts, hopefully we make some appropriate decisions because of it, right? So, all right, so this is the weekend. And of course, with the weekend, we do the top 5 news stories of the week. And of course, this is the week ending 12/2. A lot of interesting stories. So let's go ahead and jump right into it. Coming in at the number 5 spot, we have to talk about George Santos. George Santos from the great state of New York got expelled from Congress on Friday. He got walked out of the building. They wasted no time taking his name off of his office. Wasted no time changing the locks on his office. I mean, they quick, fast, and in a hurry. They got rid of him. I mean, and this was the third attempt. Remember, they tried 2 other times. Those didn't meet the threshold to expel him. This time, however, it did. We think the catalyst was probably the ethics report that was released about a week. Well, the week of Thanksgiving, right? So the week of Thanksgiving, the ethics report comes out, and it just kind of spells out the dubious things that we've already been talking about with regard to George Santos. I mean, falsifying records, wire fraud, false statements, aggravated identity theft, credit card fraud. There's a number of different things that he's already being indicted for in federal court, right? So he will get expelled and he will face those indictments come September of this or next year, 2024. So it's quite conceivable that Mr. Santos will probably spend a good portion of his life at this point in jail or in prison for his crimes. Now, if you recall, when he got elected, I mean, all the fanfare, Republicans were happy they had their first gay male in Congress. And as soon as they were celebrating that, they then kind of sat up straight because they started hearing about all of the misinformation put out by George Santos. Everything from his grandparents surviving the Holocaust to the fact that he was not necessarily Jewish by ethnicity, but just Jewish, which is kind of crazy what do you think about it? He had defrauded, I guess there's a member of Congress. His mother lives in George Santos district, and George Santos, the campaign I think it was the campaign was still taking campaign donations out of her credit card on his behalf. He had used campaign finance funds, right, for everything from lavish trips, right, to luxury watches and other gifts to himself. He even paid for his OnlyFans membership through his campaign finance fund. So now you may say to yourself, now, George, if you're going to watch OnlyFans, at least have the decency to pay for it yourself. It's not illegal, right? But the fact that you decide to use campaign finance funds in order to do it, that made it illegal, right? So I haven't seen the case for finance or campaign finance hit the docket yet. However, I imagine that case is probably somewhere in the near future on his behalf. And by the way, you know what? If you're going to watch porn, man, and you're in a spot like this, as an elected official, don't buy a membership. There's plenty of free porn out there to watch and you won't get in trouble. So it's that. Anyway, so when you think about it, he is just a weird guy, right? So he's on his way out. He's probably going to prison. And that's probably about all that we'll hear from George Santos. Although I will tell you, on his way out the door, he said that he was filing an ethics complaint against the people who voted against him. So we'll see what Congress does, or see what the House of Representatives does with that. Going to be wild. All right, so hey, that's the number 5 story. George Santos expelled from Congress and on his way to prison. So we'll see how that all turns out. In the number 4 spot, we have to talk about Donald Trump. Now, when it comes to Donald Trump, just know this. 2 major rulings, motions for dismissal, were filed by the Trump team. They were slapped down by Judge Chutkan. And some of these things were, make sure you understand this. So one of the motions for dismissal is for civil cases brought by people harmed by the Jan 6 events. So there were 2 officers, Capitol police officers, who filed cases, and there were, I think, another 11 cases that were on their way to being filed by other people who civilly feel like the ex-president is responsible for the Jan 6 event, right? So, and there are like 12 representatives in the House who have also filed cases against Donald Trump civilly, that the motion for dismissal was for presidential immunity. The judge here said that his presidential immunity does not cover the Jan 6 events, because that was candidate Trump. The acts were not part of some presidential capacity. All right, so allowed to go forward. We'll see what happens from there. Now, got to tell you, so if you're doing the math, that's some 20-odd civil cases that Donald Trump will have to deal with in some capacity, right? So, I mean, he's got a full docket. I mean, we got cases in Mar-a-Lago. We have the Jan 6 case coming out of Washington. You have the cases down in Fulton County. Wow, I feel like I'm forgetting. Oh, the civil case in New York, right? There are the civil case regarding the fraud and his business that's going forward. Remember, we're in the penalty phase of that, right? So we already know that he's been found guilty of fraud. Now we're just needing to find out how much they feel that he is responsible for, or what will be the dollar amount attached to the $250 million that sets the floor. That's the baseline. So there's a number of cases out there. And now we'll just add another 24 cases for Donald Trump. Based on things that you got, and look, in my estimation, and I've said this a number of times, so if I say this again, just know that I'm saying it because at some point you got to say to yourself, something's wrong here, right? And it's not the fact that it is. I don't believe this to be a witch hunt. And again, I'm in the vein at this point of trying to be reasonable. I'm just asking reasonable people to think of it this way. Out of any of the things that Donald Trump has been accused of or indicted for, ask yourself the question, would you do any of these things? And the reasonable person is going to say, no, they wouldn't do any of these things. So there wouldn't be a need for any reasonable people to be indicted for any of these things. But Donald Trump, I got to tell you, I don't think that he's a reasonable person. So, and I think that he's used to having things done his particular way, and he's used to being able to say whatever it is that he wants to say, to where at some point My general rule is this: if it's not illegal, then I don't have an ethical or stake in that argument. Look, what people do is what people do, but once it crosses that line of illegality, then you have to be held responsible. And when I look at the Jan 6 incident, right, that's well under well, that's sedition. That's sedition. So if it's sedition, then I think that it warrants some indictment and it warrants the American people hearing the case, right? So that's the sedition. With regard to Mar-a-Lago, when you think about Mar-a-Lago, I mean, think about it. Would you, upon leaving the White House, would you take a bunch of boxes that everyone has told you, no, that doesn't belong to you, that belongs to the archives, but you take them anyway? Would you do that? And the answer to that question, I think being a reasonable person, the answer to that question is no. Now, if you decided to take the boxes, right, would you sign off on an affidavit saying that you don't have the boxes? Probably not, right? So that's not reasonable. So the things that Donald Trump does are not reasonable. And therefore, it lands him in this situation. So it's not really a witch hunt. A lot of these things Donald Trump brings on himself. So, getting back to these 24 cases that are probably going to make their way into the discourse, 24 civil cases. Civil cases hit him in the pocketbook, right? So you got the Gene Carroll thing out there. You got the $250 million worth of fraud out there. These cases, the cases that hit him in the pocketbook are the ones I think that matter most, believe it or not. Because I don't know, I mean, the Mar-a-Lago case looks like a slam dunk. It does. But do you see Donald Trump going to jail for that? I hate to say it, but I don't. I don't see Judge Cannon issuing him any jail time for that. In the Jan 6 case, although he may be culpable at best, if he gets any time, it's probably less than a year, and they'll probably say time served, right? So I don't see that going too far, right? So I don't see any case or any of those criminal cases amounting to any type of time. Even the case down in Atlanta or down in Georgia, the racketeering case, do you see him getting any more than a year or so for that? And then the fact that he's strung us out forever, it's let's call it time served. So I don't see these cases going that far. I do see that it being important that we get some resolution on it, because you can't say or sit around and say that it's right for anyone to do this. And I heard a guy, I think his name was Ellie. He's an attorney in MSNBC, and he raised a really good point. And he said, if Donald Trump's name was Denarius Trump from New York, he would have been in jail a long time ago. And I tend to agree with that. So, I mean, for everybody who says that he hasn't received any special treatment or that this is a witch hunt and all those different things, I'm going to tell you, no. Again, I just think that there are things here that the average person just wouldn't do, or the reasonable person wouldn't do. And Donald Trump, obviously, isn't reasonable. So, enough said about Donald Trump. But at the end of the day, 24 more cases about to hit a docket coming to a theater near you with regard to Donald Trump and the civil cases due to the Jan 6 incident. Allowed to move forward. We'll see exactly how far this goes. Stay tuned. More cases to come. All right, so that's in the number 4 spot. In the number 3 spot, we got to talk about one of my favorite topics, right, people? Biomics. Biomics. Is it working? Let's find out. Okay, so we looked at numbers when I started doing this show back in October. We looked at numbers for the month of October, which looked pretty good. right? We looked at numbers now for the month of November, and what did we see? We saw, and remember, I have 5 indicators that I use. I tell everybody, get your own 5 indicators and look at them, and you can gauge as how the economy is really running. So when I look at my 5 indicators for the month of November, okay, I see jobs. The jobs report early during the month of November came in at 150,000 jobs, a little on the low side. However, within that range of, okay, we can be happy with that. So really 150 to 170, that's kind of the low mark where we want to be. So he's at 150. Okay, that's a good number. When it comes to inflation, inflation is now down to like 3.2%. That's a good number. Remember, we were as high as 9% about a year ago. So the fact that we're back down to 3.2%, and remember the target is 2%. Remember, I also said it's going to be awful hard to get to 2%. Why do I say that? Because the baselines change, right? And how did the baseline change? The baseline changed because of the Trump tariffs. They didn't exist prior to 2018. So when you look at that 2% target in its perspective, that 2% target takes into account that inflation is not there. So it will be a little bit harder to get down to that, which will come with a little bit more pain for the American people. All right, so inflation number looks good. Jobs looks good. When you look at GDP, that's the second read on GDP for the third quarter, came in at 5.2%. Remember, that's up from the first read last month, which was 4.9%. We haven't seen 5.2% GDP in a number of years. Right. So think about that. And that's the quarterly number, not the overall number, a quarterly. That's how, it's highly unlikely that you see numbers like that. No, I shouldn't say highly unlikely, but you haven't seen it in quite some time. And remember, that number is what Donald Trump was forecasting that he was going to be able to provide you while he was in office, 5-6% GDP. We never saw that, but we do see it in the Biden administration. So that's very interesting. Now, those are positive. Those 3 pieces are positive indicators, right? The two other indicators that I watch deal with consumer confidence. And when it comes to the Michigan survey, it ticked down, not in a good direction, right? The consumer confidence report later in the month, that too ticked down. So the numbers, economic numbers, when you look at jobs created, when you look at GDP, when you look at inflation, those are good. How the American people feel, still a little iffy. Now, I'm going to say that in the backdrop of this too. Remember, Joe Biden's poll numbers are, wow, they're bad. They're really bad. However, I've said it. I think that there are other people who are looking at it as well. When you look at Joe Biden's poll numbers, compare them to Donald Trump's poll numbers, we're in the same ballpark. And there's a school or consensus among economists and among political scientists that will tell you that it's hard for any president to get reelected if you have poll numbers on job approval in the 40s, and hell or harder if you're in the 30s, right? But I think when you look at these his poll numbers compared to the economic data, now I'm going to say this now, and I'll know if I'm vindicated more toward the end of the first quarter. So by the end of March, I'll know whether there's some vindication here. If the economic numbers still keep trending in a positive direction, at some point, the American people are going to give him credit for it. All right. They will give him credit for it. Now, so if I were a pollster for the Biden administration, you may be on pins and needles right now. You may be doing the Ernie Zampese smoking cigarettes and You may be nervous as hell right now. I'm going to tell you, everybody just relax. And the reason why I say that is because if these numbers keep trending in the positive direction, the economic numbers keep trending in the positive direction, his poll numbers will get a bump. Now, I don't think the bump is going to get him over 50, but I think it will probably get him in the 40s and probably maybe mid 40s, 44, 45, 46, right? Once all of the hullabaloo settles down, okay? Because people will start looking at the economy a little different if these numbers keep trending in the right direction. So everybody relax. If you're the Biden supporters, everybody just kind of relax. Now, I know that there's some other stuff hanging out there, like the Hamas Israel piece. I think everybody eventually will come to a conclusion as to how they see that too. I will say that if you are rooting for the Palestinian people, you're going to look at the Biden administration and then look at the Republican or any Republicans and say, well, I don't think Republicans are going to do the Palestinian people any favors. So even though you don't like Joe Biden's position with Israel at this point, you're going to look at what he's saying with regard to the two-state solution as more viable with a Democrat than it ever could be with Republicans. So again, look at the indicator numbers. You look at the politics surrounding it. I'm going to tell you that overall, the numbers, by the numbers of politics aside, the numbers are pointing in the right direction. At some point, the president will get credit for that or those numbers. So we'll just kind of stay tuned. So at the end of the day, what do we say? Is Bidenomics working? Well, it's only 2 months, so let's keep an eye on it, right? So we can't say. So, but it hasn't blown up anything yet. So that being the case, folks, moving on to the number 2 story. Wow, we got to talk about Newsome and DeSantis. They had a debate on Fox News. Sean Hannity moderated, right? So disclosure, right? So if it's Sean Hannity moderating the debate, just know that there's already, you might say, a political bent to the questions that will be asked of the individuals at the debate. So, and of course, that whole debate did not, in my estimation, when you look at Ron DeSantis and you look at Gavin Newsome from California, you got to say to yourself, here are 2 governors representing their state, where the facts on the ground, you might say, are different where they reside. So, for example, I'm going to tell you, when you look at California, it's a state with 40 million people in it, right? So, by contrast, Florida, a state with 20 million people in it. So when it comes to COVID deaths, I'm going to tell you, you would think 40 million people, 40 million opportunities in California versus 20 million in Florida. You would think that there would be more deaths in California than there would be in Florida, right? That's just the reasonable person's assumption of the situation. And the numbers kind of bear that out. You can, and they looked at the numbers per 100,000, right? And I think, I think California had like 450 per 100,000, and Florida was like 250 per 100,000. And DeSantis was going to say that California's numbers were different because of the liberal policies out there. No, I don't think so. I think those numbers are different because you got, hell, 20 million more people. So that's the reasonable person in me. And of course, DeSantis will say that people are moving out of California in droves. Now, wait a minute. So if you looked at the numbers, it was, again, somewhere around 400,000 people have moved from California. All right. Versus maybe again, like 250,000 people moved from Florida to other parts. Now, Gavin Newsome said that they were moving, some of them were moving to California. Now, and I saw an LA Times story that said that, but I got to tell you, I didn't believe that. I didn't believe that. That was like, yeah, that seems a little. And it would seem to me that if people weren't happy with Florida, they're probably going to go to places like Alabama, the Carolinas. I can't, see them going to California. So, but anyway, so when you try to measure each state, it's really not an apples to apples comparison. They tried to measure crime, and Gavin Newsom was saying, which is true, they're at a 50-year low in the state of California when it comes to violent crime. But, you got 40 million opportunities in California versus 20 million opportunities in the state of Florida, right? And so by the numbers, it does look like Florida is doing things better than California. However, I'm going to tell you, quite frankly, when I look at Florida, and this is really strange, okay? When I look at Florida, I look at all of the acrimony around Disney. Here you have a state that prides itself on the Republican ideology, and this is supposedly about big business, and generally hands off of big business, where you have Ron DeSantis going after Disney because they support LGBTQ opportunities and whatever else. Strange that a Republican pro-business person would be going after Disney and would be going after the Tampa Bay Rays because they say something that the governor doesn't like. It seems really, to me, bad for business. Okay. And I just think it's ironic. I'll tell you, the ironic part that came out of the debate is what happened shortly after the debate. And if you didn't know this, you're getting the first read of it here, but you have the Republicans there in Florida. I mean, they're riding hard on this LGBTQ issue, right? They're like, man, we don't want that in our state. But the chairperson of the Republican Party, his wife, and the president of the the Daughters of Liberty or whatever the hell it's called, Moms for Liberty, right? They're entangled in an LGBTQ. It's not a love affair. It was some activity to where the Moms for Liberty person ended up filing some aggravated sexual battery and some other things. So it seems almost strange to me. Seems strange to me that you got a group of people jumping up and down about these LGBTQ issues, and they seem to be knee deep in LGBTQ issues. So it's just strange. I mean, so people in glass houses should step away from throwing rocks, right? But anyway, so you see that happening. But anyway, back to Newsom and DeSantis. When you look at the two, you basically have two different philosophies. And the American people are probably looking at two individuals who will be running for president in 2028. So the calculation for the DeSantis team seems to be pretty evident. They know there's no way in hell he's going to get the nomination. DeSantis is, right? So they're just lining him up for the potential run in 2028. So we'll see. And it appears that Gavin Newsom has no desire to run for president. And it's kind of late for him to be on the board now if he wants to run for president. Again, it looks like we're telegraphing what the 2028 election cycle would look like. And you'll have your choice. I mean, and again, those choices will be rooted in your political philosophy, whether you favor the Democrat. I don't even know what the Democrat philosophy is. I can't tell you. I really, really don't know. I mean, and the reason why I don't know this is because, I mean, Gavin Newsom, in a number of respects during the debate, really didn't answer the question, right? So when you're not answering the question, I'm not sure I'm really getting a good readout on what you actually are for or what you're against. At the same time, I'm going to tell you, I agree with Ari Fleischer's assessment of Ron DeSantis. He said, well, they were asking people, how do you score this debate? And he said, Ron DeSantis, I think he gave him an A, right? And I was like, nah, not really. But then he said something like this. He said that he didn't like the fact that Ron DeSantis couldn't look Gavin Newsom in the eye. And I said to myself, he's right. He didn't. He always kind of looked away and gave that little fake smile that he was given, right? So he appeared to be uncomfortable going toe to toe with Gavin Newsom. Now, I didn't think that Gavin Newsom gave Ron DeSantis his best pitches. But I think part of that was the moderator, Sean Hannity, the way that he was building the argument. So I'm not sure that the platform really allowed a guy like Gavin Newsom to shine, because one thing about Gavin Newsom, he's a very prepared individual, right? And what I saw, he had numbers, but they were kind of like all over the place. And so it really wasn't tightly defined. But, if you ever seen Gavin Newsom and Sean Hannity go at it, Gavin Newsom knows his numbers, right? And it was just, like I said, it was just kind of, if I were to score the debate, I'd have to give both of them C's, right? Because I didn't see or hear anything that was like, even everything was kind of flashy. Even when DeSantis throws out a map and he shows San Francisco and this is where people had pooped. I was like, no, great, that's great. And then when when Newsom says at the early part of the debate, where there's one thing that we have in common, the two guys here on this stage will not be running for president in 2024. And I was like, yeah, okay. So I watched it twice, right? And I walked away thinking, no big deal. I mean, they're setting themselves up for 2028. And we'll be interested to see how this all develops. Obviously, they don't like each other, right? So the fact that they don't like each other kind of made it a little bit more entertaining. But when it came to the substantive information, look, yes, nobody in their right mind likes $4.85 gas prices, right? Nobody in their right mind wants home prices like $800,000 for a 4-bedroom house, 1,800 square feet. Nobody wants to pay that. Not even 1,800 square feet. How about 1,200 square feet? So nobody. And I'm talking about California. Nobody likes that. But when you say that people are moving out in droves, well, again, the population is 40 million people, and you got 400,000 people leaving. That's 1%. Not that serious to me. Wake me up when we get to 5%, because at 5% now people are leaving in droves. But for some reason, people stick around California. Maybe it's for the healthcare, because if you look at their numbers when it comes to healthcare, California does a better job there. Maybe it's because of just the scenery. I mean, California is a beautiful place. Ron DeSantis said it a few times. I've been to California. The bit that I did see, very beautiful, very beautiful. And you know, when I'm watching the Virgin River, hey, that place looks beautiful. Of course, that's not California, but that's a different story. You know, but the set is supposed to be California anyway. So California has some things going well for it. Florida has some things going well for it. At the end of the day, it's a fielder's choice. People make your own decision as to how you see it. But for me, when I look at the debate itself, not impressed, not that impressed by either one. I think probably more favorable long term for Gavin Newsom as opposed to Ron DeSantis. Ron DeSantis just comes off not authentic, in my estimations. Right. So, and the whole thing that happened after the debate with the Republican chairperson and the Mom for Liberty thing, just you say to yourself, this is on cue. So they're kind of like I gotta tell you, that party is do as I say, not as I do. Because there's some doozies over there. You got to just say to yourself, man, how does this stuff happen? But anyway, all right. So that's the number 2 story for the evening, or the day, I should say. When it comes to the number 1 story, folks, we got to talk about some important people. So in the number 1 spot, let's talk about, Rosn Carter. Let's talk about Henry Kissinger, and let's talk about Sandra Day OConnor. All right, these are individuals who passed away this past week and or had funerals this past week. When it comes to Rosn Carter, I got to tell you, there's nothing but, you know, great things to say about this particular lady, right? Even Betty Ford, I don't know if many people remember this. Remember when Betty Ford talked about her issues with, it was substance abuse and alcohol abuse, right? She said in one interview, and I can't find it, but she said in one interview back then, this was like, I think it was like it had to be in the early 90s. She said during that interview, when she talked to the press about her alcohol abuse and popping pills or whatever the heck it was, she said one of the first calls she received, this is Betty Ford, a Republican, right? One of the first calls she received was from Rosn Carter. And Rosn Carter was so warm and wanted to tell her that she was on her side, and she was very supportive. And man, this is, you know, it harkens back to a time to where even if you were a person on the other side of the political aisle, you still had commonality. You still had things that brought you together. And those 2 women, Betty Ford and Rosn Carter, they had a love for one another, and it was apparent when you saw them. There was a fondness there that they had for one another that was genuine. When you look at Henry Kissinger, you know what? Here's a guy, for everything that you can say about his time during the Nixon administration as Secretary of State, one thing about Henry Kissinger is true yesterday and is still true even today. Where Kissinger was on an issue, that's where he was going to stay on an issue. And he was genuine about his position. He was so genuine that even when he left the White House after Nixon left office, every president since then relied on conversations with Henry Kissinger. He was that much of a statesman. So Republican and Democrats took advice from Henry Kissinger on these stuff. That says something, again, about those commonalities, regardless of whether you're Republican or Democrat. And it's reasonable. That's my point. You know, the show's about being reasonable. It's reasonable that he felt this way and that other people regarded him in this light. He passed away at 90 or 99 years old, right? So, I mean, here's a guy, again, he just shows the face. And there was no pretense to it. right? He wasn't trying to say one thing and do another. You knew exactly where he stood. And I have an appreciation for people. When I talk to them, I don't have to agree with you, but I do want to know what it is that you stand for. And I think that in a lot of respects today, you get a lot of people who say a lot of different things, but they do something different. Case in point, the Republican chairperson in Florida and Moms for Liberty, right? So we're against LGBTQ rights, but let's have a LGBTQ relationship. So, there's that, right? So there's people like that. Strange. Okay. And the last person, you know what? Sandra Day OConnor, first woman to be appointed to the Supreme Court. And appointed by a Republican president, Ronald Reagan, right? Very conservative, right? But when it came to affirmative action, she was on board with the Democrat-leaning justice. And when it came to women's rights, she was on board with women's rights. Now, a lot of people can say things about Sandra Day OConnor. But here's another thing, another person, right? Where, I saw a story about her this past week where I think a lady she was a clerk for her. And she said that Sandra Day OConnor would bring sandwiches in for the clerks. She would, even after she left the bench, the Supreme Court, she still remained in contact with her clerks, and she would so genuine as a person. One of the clerks said that when she was interviewing for the job, she lived in California, Sandra Day OConnor was in DC. They were going to meet, and the girl was talking about coming out to Washington, D.C., but Sandra Day OConnor was originally from Arizona. So she's like, don't come to Washington, meet me in Arizona. So the young lady gets on a plane, meets her in Arizona, and guess who's at the airport to pick her up? Sandra Day OConnor picks her up in her station wagon. And they go off and they have a conversation about the clerkship and just about this person. It was just so warm and inviting, right? And you have to say, again, here's a third person where you knew exactly where you stood with them, because above all else, they weren't trying to mislead you. They were giving you the best of who they were. And there was compassion there. There's that camaraderie once again. And that's that piece. There's a human element that all three of these people show us, right? These people have passed, but there's a human element there that all three of these people have showed us that we should be mindful of in our discourse with one another. I'm not going to be right on every issue. And if you think anybody out there is going to be right on every issue, you are wrong, my friend, because it doesn't happen. But I am going to tell you how I stand on an issue. And that's what I want to hear from everybody. I want to know how you really feel about the issue, because that's the only way that we truly arrive at the truth and the facts of the matter. And that's what makes us human. That's what makes us, well, genuine people. That's what makes us look at our neighbors, even though they may be of different political stripes. And when stuff happens, that's why we get involved and we get engaged, right? Because we're human. And at the end of the day, that's what we all have in common. I got to tell you, there, in my estimation, right, there isn't that big of a difference between Democrats nor Republicans. And I say that as an independent. I'm looking at both sides, and I'm looking at, and I know, the subtle differences that we like to talk about and ad nauseum, right? At the end of the day, we're all just common people. And that's what these three individuals show us. And hopefully that is a life lesson for all of us. Folks, hey, guess what? We're at the end of the show. I want you to like and subscribe. Hope you enjoyed this show today. Look forward to your comments and look forward to more people jumping on this channel. Look forward to growing this channel over the next few months because, like I said, I will have the time. Just leaving my busy season. Things are winding down. It's the end of the year. So I look forward to putting out more content over the next few weeks. And hopefully we can get more people engaged with the process because guess what, folks? Whether you're left or right, the politics is important. However, hopefully we'll see some things that hopefully open up our eyes because at the end of the day, what are we trying to do? We're trying to be reasonable about all of these things. At the end of the day, my position isn't absolute, and I hope your position isn't absolute either. We should have some way to be able to approach our differences. All right. All that being said, folks, I want you to have a great afternoon today. Enjoy your family and friends. And there's some football games to watch today. It's Sunday, right? So there's some football games to watch today, and there's just good relationships that you should have all across the board. So all that being said, folks, have a wonderful day. Enjoy the balance of this weekend. And of course, I'll see you next week.